promises to the people Israel, which Luke and his friends believed were uniquely fulfilled in Jesus. And so in the Old Testament, God says something is going to happen, and Luke believes, and the other gospel writers believed, and the church believed that in Jesus it happened. And so Luke is telling us there was promise, and then in Jesus there is fulfillment. Luke says many have undertaken to tell us this. He's referring to the other gospel writers, and the word many here is a bit misleading in the English translation. It doesn't necessarily mean many as we would think of it. He's simply trying to say others have undertaken to do this. And what he wants to tell us is that something has been promised and something has been fulfilled. That's what the others are trying to tell us, and that's what Luke is trying to tell us. And if you had to pick one word to summarize what was promised and what was fulfilled, it would have to be salvation, especially for Luke. Salvation is one of the great themes of Luke, and it's really interesting to read Luke and then Acts and to see the different ways in which salvation is evidenced in the ministry of Jesus and the ministry of the apostles. It comes in all different ways, and especially in Luke, to all different kinds of people. Luke is the writer more than any other who emphasizes how God's salvation extends to the margins of society, to the fringes, to the least, to the poor, the oppressed, to the women who were marginalized in those days. Luke is one who emphasizes how salvation comes to those who seek the Lord no matter who you are. And so this first stage of Luke's process is that the events happened as they were promised. The second stage is that they were witnessed and delivered. That is, eyewitnesses saw what happened and told others. Now, two of the gospel writers were apostles. That would be Matthew and John. They saw what happened. But the other two, Mark and Luke, were not apostles. They came along later. They were not eyewitnesses. So what Mark wrote down was based on what people told him, and then what Luke wrote down was based on what people had told Mark and what other people had told him, and then a lot of his other research. But he says there were eyewitnesses, people who saw what Jesus did, and then either verbally or in writing handed that tradition, those stories, those incidences down to the next generation. And so these events in Jesus' life were witnessed and then delivered. And this word for eyewitness in Greek actually comes down to us in English as the root for our word autopsy. And an autopsy is obviously a medical term where we carefully observe a corpse and try to determine what happened based on careful observation. And so the eyewitnesses saw. The intention here by using this word is Luke saying these people saw what happened, and it wasn't just a casual seeing, a casual glance, a fleeting memory. These were people, the sources Luke used were people who carefully observed what happened and then passed down that information to Luke. Luke then follows up by getting into the next stage of the process by investigation. Luke researched carefully, including interviews. Remember, here's where this word autopsy comes in. Luke was a medical doctor. He was a very careful man, and there are two or three scriptures in the New Testament where Luke is mentioned, and at least one of those mentions Luke as a medical doctor. And so when Luke talks about how carefully he examined the sources and how carefully he worked in following up with those sources, we can imagine that he had to be a careful person to be a medical doctor. And this partly answers the question, why did 30 plus years pass between the events and the Gospel of Luke? Well, what seems to have happened is that Luke took the time to do the proper research. He walked up and down the land. He went back to the land, to the places where these things happened, and he interviewed people. In fact, it's pretty clear, it seems pretty obvious that one person whom Luke interviewed personally had to be Mary, the mother of Jesus. Because if you go on and read in the early chapters of Luke, the things that Luke tells us are things that only Mary could have known. and passed on. And the detail with which Luke captures these is quite amazing. And so Luke, we are almost sure that what he did during these 30 years was walk up and down the land and interview people and confirm what other people had told him, what the eyewitnesses had told him. The great English preacher G. Campbell Morgan once said that the divine element in the Bible is never perfectly discovered and realized until the human element is recognized. Let me say that again. The divine element in the Bible, that is the God stuff in the Bible, is never perfectly discovered and realized until the human element is recognized. And Luke knew this. Luke wasn't just going to tell us what he thought about Jesus and what God was telling him about Jesus in his personal subjective prayer life. He was going to tell us what happened in the course of human events. As human events unfolded, Luke as a historian and as a medical doctor wanted us to know exactly what happened in the human dimension so we could know God in the divine. And that gets us now to the fourth stage here, that Luke, after these events happened, promise and fulfillment, after eyewitnesses handed down their accounts, after Luke did all this careful research, he wrote it down. He put it in writing. And he says here in verse 1, "It seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." Who is this Theophilus? Well, my name is Theodore, and that means gift of God. Thank you, Mom, for that name. Theophilus means lover of God. Theophilus means, just like Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. That word philos means love, and so Theophilus means lover of God. But we don't know anything more about Theophilus than his name, and that he sponsored Luke's research. So Theophilus is the patron. And if you were writing a classical piece of Greek literature, as you opened your account, you would thank the patron. And so this is what Luke is doing here. He's thanking the one who paid for all these 30 or so years of research. And it's unclear whether this book, this massive book, once it was written, Luke, Acts, actually hit the public book market, as it were. Scholars are divided on that question, but certainly Luke intended it for more than just Theophilus to read. If we read it, it comes across almost like a personal letter that he's writing to Theophilus, but what he's really doing here is thanking his sponsor, the one who paid for his research. And so Luke writes it down. He takes all this and writes it down in an orderly way. He organizes it. And the way, as I alluded to in the opening, the way Luke organizes his writing is geographically. He goes from Rome to Jerusalem to Galilee and then back, moving towards Rome in an orderly way. Finally, Luke says he writes so that his readers, including Theophilus and including us, will know Jesus with certainty. And this Greek word that's behind the word for certainty has to do with providing solid footing. That is, getting a good step and being sure of where you're stepping so that you don't fall down. My son has the best balance of anyone I've ever met. This kid right here, lift up your hand, there he is, pointed out my two older kids so far in the sermon. I don't know if I'll get to the younger ones today, but this kid can jump from rock to rock like no one I've ever seen. He's got amazing balance, and I can't do that. I've got terrible balance. I think he gets it from his mother, for sure. She's definitely the more athletic of the two of us. But as we get older and more brittle, it's so important to keep our balance so that we don't fall and break something, isn't it? It's crucial that we step and we're sure of where we're stepping. And that's where this word comes from, certainty. Luke wants us to know, to have confidence in what he's writing down. And so he's very, very careful. He's done all the research, he's investigated, he's writing it down, and he wants us to have confidence that as we read, we know that we are on solid ground, so that we can know for sure that what we're believing is true, and that the portrait of Jesus that Luke